Okay, so I have to apologize. I also pulled a fast one, and I'm presenting a different paper to which I'd proposed. And partly that just recognizes the time constraints. So I wanted to talk about one specific issue rather than providing a more general... Yeah, I needed help. So this is one set of issues I was intending to talk about, but I thought I'd just spend my time on that. So this is joint work with Stefano and Mark, who are both at the New York Fed. And the idea is to think a little bit about questions of forecasting and how long-term pricing actually affects the ability of a central bank to control the macroeconomy. So the modern theory of policy evaluation emphasizes the importance of managing expectations, right? And specifically when we think about New Keynesian theory, it's well understood that it's not so much current interest rates, but anticipated movements in future interest rates that are relevant to aggregate demand. And so most discussions then in that context focus on, well, what's the most desirable way to have these expectations evolve over time, and in particular desirability means to achieve the best kind of short-run trade-off between output and inflation. And so one obviously then thinking about these optimal commitment equilibria, what happens if a central bank has limited or imprecise control over people's expectations? Does that in some way compromise a central bank's ability to control the economy? And so really you can ignore all that. So what I want to think about is kind of, I mean it's all related, I've just restated it. What I want to do is then think about a model of what happens if a central bank has loose control over people's expectations. Does this impair the ability to control aggregate demand and therefore inflation? And so it's not hard to find quotes in a practical context. So this is one by Ben Bernanke that kind of explains that it's not so much the short end of the yield curve that's relevant to economic decisions. We're really concerned about longer yields, and that at times, at least in his view, that the link between the short end and the long end of the yield curve can be quite loose. And so I want to build a model that has exactly that property. So the model is going to be a very simple one. It's going to be just the standard New Keynesian model, and it's going to determine essentially the output gap, inflation, and nominal interest rates. The only twist that I'm going to add to this is just a single informational friction. So I'm going to assume that agents have imperfect knowledge about the economy, and what this means is that they just don't understand what the equilibrium mechanics of the economy are, how states get mapped into equilibrium prices that are relevant to their decisions. So I'm going to assume, much like the agenda that George outlined this morning, that agents are going to act like econometricians. They're going to look at historical patterns in data between these prices and state variables, and they're going to extrapolate those patterns into the future to forecast prices relevant to their decisions. Otherwise, the mechanics of the model are completely standard. Given this, I'm then going to ask, well, what are the consequences of different theories about how individuals in this imperfect information world might have, or different theories about financial market expectations, how might this affect the ability of the central bank to control the macroeconomy? And what I'm going to show is essentially these theories are going to be indexed by the composition of the public debt that's going to be available in this economy. And as I vary the composition of public debt, this is going to give rise to kind of different expectations about future interest rates. And in particular, I'm going to show that these different expectations may not be consistent with the expectations hypothesis of the yield curve. And we want to ask, is this a constraint on the ability to control the macroeconomy? So I'm going to think about a world in which we have kind of a very simple yield curve, which is going to be specified by two types of debt instruments. On the one hand, we're going to have just one period debt, right? So the government in the background's got to fund purchases that we can assume are just given exogenously period by period. They can fund that by taxation and issuing two kinds of debt. One is just going to be one period bonds, and they're going to be in zero net supply. The purpose of kind of specifying these specifying this particular debt instrument is purely to define the one period interest rate, which is going to be the instrument of central bank monetary policy. The second debt instrument's just are going to be a bond portfolio, which is going to have the property that this bond portfolio is going to pay off unity in one period time, rho, which is a fraction in 2 periods time, rho squared in 3 periods time, and so on, down the yield curve, down the kind of into the infinite future. The way that you could think about this is just a portfolio of infinitely many bonds where the 1 period bond has weight unity in the portfolio, the 2 period bond weight rho, and so on, down the yield curve, right? And in this way, it's going to give me a very simple way to think about different maturity structures by varying rho. So a rho of equal to 0 is going to be a portfolio purely of one period debt. A rho equal to 1 is going to be essentially console bonds. And so by varying this parameter rho, I'm going to think about different average maturity structures, and comparing the yield of this asset onto the one period debt is going to give me kind of a crude yield curve that I can think about, well, what are the consequences then for monetary policy control? So that's the asset structure. I'm not going to talk about the details of the optimization problem. It's fairly standard. What comes out, of course, from the portfolio decision problems, of course, are two Euler equations, which is going to give us the following restriction to a log linear approximation. It's going to relate the price on the one period bond, PTS, to expected movements in the prices of this multiple period asset, right? So this is a standard no arbitrage condition, which is going to put restrictions on these asset price movements. Of course, there's a transversality condition in the background. I can solve this restriction forward to price the asset of this multiple maturity bond as just the expected present discounted value of all future interest rates. The discount factor, of course, is beta, coming from the household's valuation of income streams. And of course, rho tells us just what those income streams are going to be in any given future period. I'm going to call this a kind of basically this approach, because it's really pricing the asset as a function of expected fundamentals, and it's basically a statement of the expectations hypothesis of the term structure. I'm going to call this anchored financial market expectations. Anchored because I'm going to exploit all optimality conditions in the model, right, to pin down asset prices. And so this is just the terminology that I'll use. So this is one theory of asset pricing. What does that then mean for economic decisions? Well, there's going to be in the back, of course, households going to solve an intertemporal consumption allocation problem. It's got a labor supply problem that it supplies labor to the production of differentiated goods. But really it just gives us a description or a consumption decision rule conditional on their beliefs at any point in time, which is just given according to permanent income theory. So the second line here is telling us that agents will make spending plans conditional on the present discounted value of their wage income. That wage income is just weighted by some coefficients that come out of the micro foundations. Gamma is just the Frisch elasticity. Theta is just the elasticity of demand across differentiated goods. And gamma hat is just dividends. So this is wage and dividend income on the lower line. Of course, you're going to value that according to time-varying interest rates. And so in a log linear approximation, the top line captures that time variation in real interest rates. And those interest rates vary due to variation in nominal interest rates and also variation in goods prices, and specifically inflation. Okay, the importance of putting this kind of this is just optimal consumption demand conditional on whatever belief structure you want to write down. But what's interesting is that it's actually completely independent of the maturity structure of assets. So I'm making an important assumption here, is that I'm assuming that agents understand that policy is Ricardian, so there's no reason for them to forecast taxes, there's no reason for them to forecast aggregate debt. So this is a theory, or this approach is that consumption demand is completely independent of the structure of issued debt, and this is exactly the same under a rational expectations version of the model, right? So I'm not doing anything fancy here. Now this gets back to a discussion we were having earlier today. Now, let's suppose we entertain an alternative theory of asset pricing in this world, right? So once we have incomplete markets and non-rational expectations, there are kind of multiple ways we could think about how we might impose no arbitrage and think about pricing assets. And so we could suppose that maybe we could think about this no arbitrage condition as pricing, a theory of pricing directly, right? So suppose people forecast bond prices tomorrow, given a statement or a knowledge of monetary policy which determines current interest rates, this no arbitrage condition then just determines a price for this long debt in period T. So this is an example of what George was calling kind of one period ahead forecasting models, right? It doesn't exploit a transversality condition, but it's a possible theory of asset pricing. And as was alluded to by Roman earlier, Albert Marcet and Klaus Adam have been kind of developing theories under which you might think that this is kind of a micro-founded description of asset pricing. But I don't have time to talk about that further. Okay. I'm going to insist under this view of asset pricing that people nonetheless will forecast in such a way that they don't anticipate no arbitrage opportunities. So in this view, I'm going to assert that people forecast future bond prices, and they're going to back out an interest rate consistent forecast, an interest rate that's consistent with no arbitrage from this relation. So in future periods, they're going to forecast interest rates by using forecasts of bond prices. Now, the importance of this is that it's going to mean that there are going to be departures from the expectations hypothesis of the term structure. An easy way to think through that, suppose rho is equal to 0, then observing interest rate data is the same as observing bond price data, right? So if you want to have a given forecasting model, say you just want to forecast the average of these data, seeing interest rate data is the same as seeing bond price data when you have one period debt. Of course, as the average maturity lengthens, realizations of interest rates will be different to realizations in bond prices, right? Okay. Now, I'm not going to assume that people have an independent forecasting model of interest rates. They're actually going to back out a no arbitrage consistent forecast of interest rates from this condition, backed out from their bond prices. As rho moves from 0 and we lengthen the average maturity structure, this forecast of interest rates is going to become more and more reliant on the bond price data, and it's going to be less and less related to realizations of interest rates in this economy. Another way to state that is that the observed bond price and the observed interest rate expectations are going to become less and less consistent with this anchored expectations theory of the bond price. Another way to state that is as I lengthen the average maturity structure, the interest rate forecasts are going to become less and less consistent with the expectations hypothesis of the term structure. And so I want to ask in that way, right, so when rho equals 0, of course, this all nests the original case, but as rho increases, we can ask, well, does this break down in the maturity structure matter? So mechanically, I'm just going to plug in for interest rates these bond price forecasts from the no arbitrage condition, and you can see when rho equals 0, this is exactly the same demand function that I had before, right, because the bond price is going to be the negative of the period interest rate, okay? And so this is the model I'll study, and you should understand whenever you see rho equals 0, we have one period debt, this is isomorphic to a world where you have anchored expectations. Whenever we have longer maturity debt, we have unanchored financial market expectations. There are increasing divergences from the expectations hypothesis, so these arbitrage relationships are in some sense getting weaker, and we're going to ask, well, what are the consequences of that? I should have said what I'm doing here, and in fact, George used the term infinite horizon learning earlier today. I'd prefer just to think about it as all I'm doing here is solving an anticipated utility model. Given the beliefs, I'm just going to solve the model out, assuming that individuals don't take into account that they revise their beliefs in future periods. I'm going to assume very simple world here. I'm going to have a constant gain learning and just assume people are going to forecast averages. That might bother you, but you could think about kind of a first order approximation to the beliefs around, well, the mean dynamics induced by the beliefs, and in fact you can show that the only things that are relevant in that log linear approximation to beliefs will be the constants. So I think it's quite general in that sense. So people are going to forecast these things. Just to emphasize again, in the anchored financial market expectations case, people will forecast interest rates using interest rate data, right? That's the top line. In the case of unanchored financial market expectations, individuals are going to forecast interest rates using bond price data, right? And they're going to back out interest rate forecasts from that bond price data. These two objects are only the same when rho equals 0. So when you have one period debt, they're isomorphic, okay? I'm going to calibrate, so I'm going to do everything numerically, and I'm going to study this across this economy across different gains. So I'm not going to talk about E-stability, but I'm going to call what I think George Evans calls robust stability. I'm just going to think, what are the stability properties of the model across different gains, right? So essentially I'm just looking for roots in the system that ensure stability. So the first exercise I want to do is just think about a simple rule, what happens under a Taylor rule, okay? And broadly you can think of a gain equal to 0 as just the case of expectational stability. So this is a plot of stability regions for a simple Taylor rule, there are three different curves. They're indexed by three different responses to the to output, but you can see that that doesn't matter too much for the purposes of our discussion. Downstairs we have different maturity structures. Upstairs we have the phi pi, the response to inflation that's required to ensure stability. Regions above are stable. Regions, what have we got now? Yes. Regions above are stable, regions below are unstable, right? And what you can see here is that for higher rows, for longer maturity debt structures, you need much more aggressive monetary policy in order to stabilize the economy. What's the intuition? Well, it's just that these anticipated movements in future interest rates are becoming less and less of a restraining influence on aggregate demand. Mechanically rewriting the model in terms of the output gap xt and rearranging some terms, you can see these future asset prices in the first infinite sum upstairs, right? As rho becomes to 1, these expected movements in bond prices become less and less relevant, right? That's the only connection that the model has to interest rate movements, right? Except for the initial interest rate, right? So as these future bond prices become less relevant, the central bank has to be much more aggressive in moving current interest rates because it can't rely on anticipated movements of interest rates to stabilize the economy. So that's the first key insight. Another insight before we just think about a final exercise, which is going to be fully optimal policy, is to suppose what happens if a central bank implements a target criterion that comes from a rational expectations analysis of the model, but in this learning model. And they understand that people are learning, right, given their implementation of this target criterion. So this comes out of optimal discretion. It says central bank, in order to implement that optimal discretion equilibrium, should keep inflation proportional to the output gap. Right? And we can back out an instrument rule given the aggregate demand relation and the Phillips curve, which I haven't described to you, right, that ensures that that target criterion is met period by period, right? And what's appealing about these implied interest rate rules is that they guarantee that policy is always sufficiently aggressive to implement that target criterion. It's also going to respond to all future expectations, including these asset price expectations. So you might think that would confer certain stabilization advantages. So this now plots stability regions in the gain average maturity space, right? So the gains downstairs, the average maturity debts upstairs. And what you can see is for any given average maturity, as we increase the gain, right, at some point we run the risk of moving into the instability region, which is on the right of this contour. What's going on there is that higher gains just mean expectations are more volatile. You're using a shorter amount of data. Expectations shift around more. That makes the world more unstable. As we increase the average maturity for a given gain, we see that some other properties emerge. And in particular, as the average maturity rises, the stability region for, in some sense, as we increase the gain, tends to rise. What's going on there is that as the average maturity structure breaks down, rises, this relationship between current interest rates and future interest rates gets weaker and weaker, right? So this affords the ability of the central bank to move interest rates much more aggressively. And importantly, those interest rate movements don't feed back into expectation movements about future interest rates that can themselves be destabilizing, right? So if you move interest rates around a lot today and people then let that feed through into their beliefs, that can be destabilizing. As you increase the average maturity, current interest rate movements have less information about future interest rate movements and they're less relevant for aggregate demand. So this suggests that there are kind of two effects at play. On the one hand, higher gains are going to imply more volatility in the economy, right, and therefore more aggressive adjustments in interest rates, right? But those adjustments in interest rates can herald adjustments in people's expectations about interest rates, which themselves can be destabilizing. On the other hand, this weaker link between current interest rate movements and future interest rates, as this term structure relationship breaks down, permits more aggressive policy. So these two things trading off each other, we can ask, well then, what are the implications? So in some sense here, this was alluded to by Mordecai's talk, is that beliefs themselves are going to be an additional constraint on policy. Because people are learning, this slow adjustment in beliefs is going to represent an additional constraint on monetary policy design, right? And this is something that the central bank has to contend with, along with other distortions, which in this case is going to be sticky prices, right? So the fact that you can't move interest rates around too much is going to limit the scope that a central bank has. So in a world where the term structure is approximately correct, this is going to limit the ability of the central bank to move interest rates around, because that's going to feed through into expectations, which feeds back in a destabilizing way. So it's going to limit the ability to kind of respond to current macroeconomic developments. So as a final exercise, I wanted to think about kind of a best case scenario, which is to think about fully optimal policy given some objective function, right? So here I'll think about a quite general objective function, which is to stabilize movements or variations in inflation, output, and interest rates, right, both relative to some targets, and we could think about various weights given by lambda x and lambda I that determine the relative stabilization priorities, and this minimization is going to be subject to all structural relations in this economy. So aggregate demand and supply, no arbitrage equation, the belief structure, and I'm just going to talk about cost-push shocks today. So we derive a proposition which is only interesting to the extent that it says we can always find a policy that solves this optimization problem, and moreover, this policy is going to be dynamically stable for all gains on the unit interval, right? And what's interesting is this can be solved using standard methods. This is an advantage of just having people forecast means. It implies that one just has a kind of standard linear rational expectations model for the central bank that we can then explore the consequences of. In the world of no uncertainty, it's interesting you can derive conditions under which you back out the optimal commitment equilibrium under rational expectations and the optimal discretion equilibrium under rational expectations. Let me just talk about the uncertain case in which we have no stabilization weight on nominal interest rates. And so what I want to do is just talk about the dynamics and then say something and connect back to these kind of different influences that affect the stabilization trade-off for the central bank. So this plot gives us impulse responses to a cost-push shock in 3 different economies. The red dashed line is the optimal commitment equilibrium under rational expectations. The green dashed line is the unanchored expectations economy, and the blue line is going to be the anchored expectations economy. So the red line is very familiar. You see, given a cost-push shock, we have a rise in inflation, a fall in the output gap. But the optimal policy is one that restrains aggregate demand, not just today, but into the future, and in that way you can bring down inflation from a positive level to some small negative level before slow convergence back to steady state. And that's engineered by just a small increase in interest rates, but one that's inertial before slow reversion to steady state. If you look at the unanchored expectations case, the impact effects aren't dissimilar to the optimal commitment equilibrium under rational expectations. You get a rise in inflation, you get a contraction in output, and you see that in this bottom left-hand panel, you see that short-term interest rates rise quite aggressively today, much more than observed under rational expectations, and also tomorrow. I've plotted in the final panel the interest rate spread, so the difference between the long rate implied by the model and the short rate, and what one can see is that these long rates don't move too much, right? So it's in this sense that the expectations hypothesis is breaking down. You can move interest rates very aggressively today, but they don't feed through into longer rates, okay? And this gives the ability to kind of replicate, in some sense, features of the optimal commitment equilibrium. The blue line's quite distinct. It's the anchored expectations case, and here the central bank has very limited opportunity to respond to this cost-push shock. It has to accept quite a significant rise in inflation, right? It gets as a trade-off, right? This is just how it's valuing the short-run trade-off between output and inflation. It gets a much smaller recession in terms of the output gap. Why is that? It's because any movement in interest rates today would feed back into expected movements in interest rates tomorrow, and therefore movements in the long rates, right? And you can see long rates move much more significantly in this economy than in an unanchored expectations, financial market expectations economy, right? So this is kind of represents the constraint on current policy. It's an inability to respond, right, to current macroeconomic conditions, because movements in current interest rates will feed back into expectations about interest rates, and they can be potentially destabilizing. this plot is suggestive. It kind of suggests that, in fact, interest rates will be moving around a lot in this unanchored expectations case, right? So on the one hand, you can replicate kind of impact effects that are close to the optimal commitment equilibrium, but the cost is you get a lot of interest rate volatility. So what I want to do is just kind of explore that by looking at Taylor frontiers. So I'm going to compute some losses, right, just the sum of the variances of the three objects that are relevant to stabilization, inflation, output, and interest rates. And I'm going to compare movements in the sum of the first two terms to variance of inflation on interest rates on the other axis. Right? So this figure is now going to give me Taylor frontiers for a range of different economies. Downstairs I have variance in interest rates. Upstairs I've got the sum of the variance of inflation plus the output gap. So rational expectations under a cost push shock, we get a very familiar Taylor frontier. It just says that if we don't accept any interest rate volatility, we're going to get fairly substantial volatility in inflation and output. As we accept more and more interest rate volatility, we can lower the sum of inflation and output volatility. If we go to economies with very, very short maturity debt, so the anchored expectations economy is the upper leftmost contour here. It's a rho equal to 0. As I increase the maturities, and these are really 3 to 5 months, the ones that are plotted, right, you can see that the trade-off is kind of similar, but you have to accept a much higher loss in output or inflation, right? Volatility in interest rates isn't that substantial, and this just reflects that in the case that you don't want interest rates to feed through into interest rate expectations, and therefore volatility in long rates, you're not going to move interest rates around too much. The price, you have to accept higher volatility in output inflation. Going to the unanchored expectations economies, right, so where you have very longer maturity debt, so the US maturity structure would be a number of about 0.96, right, for a row. And these economies, you can see, you can achieve much lower output and inflation volatility, but the price is you have much more substantial volatility in nominal interest rates, right? And this is the inherent trade-off. So to the extent that agents are learning, and to the extent that the kind of restraining influence of the expectation hypothesis breaks down, it's going to have consequences for stabilization policy. And really it says you either accept much higher interest rate volatility to achieve lower output and inflation volatility, or you accept much higher output and inflation losses if you want to stabilize interest rates. And so I'm probably close to being out of time. I mean, this raises some kind of obvious questions. If you're going to jack this interest rate around a lot, what are the implications for the zero lower bound on interest rates? And so a final calculation we do, I won't explain how you do it. We're going to do some calibration. I've just run out of time. But what this does is plot the frequency that you would hit the zero lower bound in some simulations, right, across these three different economies as a function of your concern for interest rate volatility, right? Okay, and what it says is that, you know, if you don't care about interest rate volatility under the optimal policy, under rational expectations, you'd hit the zero lower bound about 27% of the time. If you take Mike's number from his book as a stabilization weight for lambda I think it's 0.08 something. So then you basically have zero frequency of hitting the zero lower bound under rational expectations. Under the optimal policy, under anchored expectations, you almost never hit the zero lower bound. This is because you really don't want to move interest rates around because that creates instability through people's expectations. In contrast, and not surprisingly, under the unanchored expectations case, because you're moving this interest rate around very aggressively because it's not feeding through the term structure to future movements in interest rates, you actually end up hitting the zero lower bound a lot, even when you care a lot about interest rate stabilization. And in fact, the lower bound for our simulation is that you hit the zero lower bound about 14% of the time in kind of our post-war calibration. So let me leave it there.